Welcome to the recorded version of Sprout Lab's webinar on content curation for learning. Our webinars are fairly interactive experiences, so we actually don't record the live sessions. We find that people interact the less if they actually are recorded. So then what I do afterwards is these separate recordings. This also is one of the reasons why the webinars run for an hour and the recordings are a whole lot shorter. If you're wondering who I am, I'm Dr. Robin Pettit, the founder of Sprout Labs. Also quite often the sort of front person for Sprout Labs for doing things like webinars, presentations, and first point of contact. Sprout Labs builds digital learning platforms that helps you and your team to author, deliver, and measure high-impact digital learning ecosystems. Talk in a few more moments about some of the actual platforms we work with. If this is the first recording you've listened to from Sprout Labs, essentially there's lots of content we produce. There's a Learning While Working podcast, there's a regular blog post, a series of ebooks. Sometimes we actually turn webinars into ebooks, recordings of past webinars, and also our virtual conference that ran in July 2019. Or 2018, and will be running again in 2019. In actual fact, if you want to hear my voice for hours and hours on end, you can listen to the podcast and go through all the webinar recordings as well. Just a bit about some other content from Sprout Labs. If this is the first webinar recording you're listening to, we actually regularly run webinars essentially about once a month. We have the Learning While Working podcast, a regular blog post, and a series of ebooks that are available in the resource section of our website. We run a yearly virtual conference which brings together past podcast presenters for a real-time online live event. In the resources section of your website, you'll be able to find the recordings from past years of this as well. So the three platforms we work with is Glasshouse, which is our own platform, which is a cloud-based learning content authoring platform. It has some great features for doing repository-style content curation, which is essentially the reason why I'm talking about content curation today. Tatara and the Tatara Learn and Tatara Social, these are open, flexible, and affordable learning platforms that really allow you to be able to really customize and build learning experiences the way you want them to be. Yield is a machine learning engine for XAPI data. It means you can bring in data from multiple different sources and do things like make recommendations on that data, and then also be in a spot where you can make predictions about how people are going compared to each other. At the time I'm recording this, Yield is still under development. You can sign up to get early access to it, but it will be available to start with as part of Glasshouse as well. During this session, we're going to be exploring these dot points, essentially why content curation is important to the future of learning, the different approaches to content curation, and really that's probably the focus of the webinar, the different approaches to content curation. Embedded in that sort of discussion around approaches is platforms and tools that you can use for content curation for learning, and also what people get wrong with content curation for learning. And also, it's actually partly about the sort of future and why content curation as well. Is why content curation for learning is really different to other disciplines. People quite often think about it being the same as content curation in all other areas. So I'm finding it quite useful to start webinars and blog posts with exploring a definition, because essentially partly a definition, and this is my own definition of content curation, for learning. It's a good way to sort of frame a position and a viewpoint. So, for me, content curation for learning is the process of selecting existing resources, designing learning experiences based on those resources, and sharing those experiences. There's a couple of key things here that are quite different to a lot of other definitions of content curation, and I'll really explore this a lot more in this recording. And it's probably the designing learning experiences that's a little bit different. It's not just about sort of bringing in, collecting, and sharing, but it's also about building actual learning experiences as well. Content curation is not new. At the lead up for this, someone reminded me in a LinkedIn comment that essentially people like art curators and exhibition curators have a long tradition of selecting, organizing, and presenting artifacts. In actual fact, a curator now does a whole lot more than just this process of selecting. They build events around it, as well as publications and it's not just about that process of presenting either. Now, one of the most valuable frameworks around content curation is this one from Harajaki. Sorry if I mispronounced his name. Of sense, seek, and share. We'll actually use this particular through the rest of the session, but I do actually have some issues with it because it's really a framework that is designed for knowledge management and is really powerful for personal knowledge management as well. And when someone's actually involved in the process of personally seeking, sensing, and sharing. But learning is not knowledge. In learning, process is king. The process of getting feedback, practicing, and reflection. Content is important, but you need to really get behavior change. You need to do more than just provide some people to some links to some blog posts. That's not going to transform how they work. It might help them along with a bit more information, but it's not going to really drive behavioral change. I actually think this whole core thing about the fact that people think about, especially in digital learning, that really the focus is too much on content. We actually talk about learning content quite often, rather than sitting there going to talking about learning process. So one of the exciting things about this whole notion of content curation is there might be a spot where you can actually move away from having to focus so much on content to really starting to think about process, because in actual fact the content's pre-existing. I actually sometimes wonder what's actually meant by the idea of learning content. Do people mean learning? What do they really mean by that term? Maybe that articulates nicely into this framework from Ron Oliver and Jen Harrington from their Teaching and Learning Online from 2001. Nearly 20 years ago, this framework was put together. It was actually put together when they were asked to do a review of the flexible learning frameworks that were being produced in the vocational education sector at that stage. Essentially, a lot of money was being invested in these big projects to develop resources, learning resources, content, and they weren't working. Teachers weren't adopting them. Learners hated them. And what, in actual fact, they discovered was a lot of what was being produced was a resource. It was it wasn't actually a learning experience. It had this sort of, to actually be a learning experience, it needed this wider idea of tasks for people to do things, for there to be supports, which I quite often think about the sort of notion of a support being the interaction between people and the interaction between facilitators and learners and peers. And then in the middle, where all these things cross over, is assessment. I think it's quite a powerful way of being able to think around the notion of how learning is designed. It also has quite a nice mapping over to the 70-20-10 model, in terms of the 10 being the resources, the 70 being tasks in the workplace, hopefully, the support being the 20 of peer and manager support as well. The thing is, a lot of content curation sits in this resources area of just getting more information back out to people and not building the tasks and supports around it, which is what's really exciting about the idea of building learning experiences based on content curation. So previously I thought it was that framework I made that hint around personal learning experiences and personal knowledge management. And I think it's really important to think about who's doing the learning with content curation. We've actually discovered a couple of times with content curation projects with clients, it's actually the people who are doing the curation. They're actually feeling like they're learning the most. We had one particular medical educator who was working on one repository, and she just sat there and went, I don't think my knowledge has ever been quite so deep, because essentially she was trawling through papers and resources every day to figure out what everyone else needed to know about. And so it's sort of interesting, because essentially the curator is quite often the person who's doing the deep learning. This is also maybe a learning strategy to use as well, to actually get people to be curating and seeking and sensing themselves, to be able to actually be in a spot where they are really strong learners. A really good example of this is Stephen Downes. Stephen was a MOOC pioneer. he works in the Canadian Research Institute, and he is quite sort of academic and writes a lot about education. Essentially, he publishes a daily newsletter. He has his own platform which he goes on to, and he reads things feed in a way that I'll talk about a little in a few moments. And then he comments on them, and then they, as these comments happen and as the links happen, they automatically shared back out to his mailing list. His mailing list happens to be about 60,000 people the last time I heard, but he's not doing it for them. He's doing it for his own personal learning experience, so that he's in a spot where he's processing the information. He's not just reading it, he's commenting on it to actually then sort of have a deeper engagement with it, to think through it a bit more. I think it's just a really nice example of a personal learning environment, and an environment where he's going out seeking, sensing, and sharing, and then the sharing has a side effect of then having an audience as well. The thing is, and this is why we look towards these types of people, he's making a sense of the deluge of information, and sometimes that's a very basic level of what content curation can achieve. Can actually probably achieve a lot more by actually focusing more on commentary, more on learning experiences, rather than just being a selection process. It has a power to be really quite transformational. And it is really important to the future of learning, especially in a situation where quite often the content that our people need in organisations is actually already out there. It already exists out on the internet. So this is sort of partly my map of where learning is now, and where it's moving to in the future. Actually, not so much moving into the future, actually happening literally right now. So in the past, very much learning was about sharing how the business works, focusing on things like inductions, and then learning programs were often the only way to access information. The future, and we're seeing more and more demands being made of learning and development to help drive the future the expertise of the organisation. Things like digital transformation, AI and automation. And quite often this is interesting because it's expertise that's outside of the organisation that needs to be dragged in. The content quite often actually exists outside of the organisation on the net, and it's a matter of just sort of content curating that to bring it in to the organisation. It's quite a sort of powerful way of to think about it. Now, the other thing in terms of the future of learning, that people that we sort of want to be our employees are self-guided. These are the people who are self-guided learners who are naturally leading change and preparing for the future. This is some of the principles we have around what self-guided learners do. They're able to self-assess, identify their learning needs, they're able to find resources. Content curation is perfect for that. They're able to articulate and reflect on what they've learned. And then they find spots to be able to practice and trial new behaviours and seek out feedback on their performance. And they're also really able to evaluate and measure their own learning. I think it's really exciting when you can actually start to build learning experiences which, instead of being this spot where you're constantly guiding people down almost like a tunnel of clicks on a slide presentation, to actually just sit there and pause for a moment and go, actually, how can we actually let people have more freedom so they actually start to be at a spot where they can start to be more self-guided? Content curation can be quite powerful for this, because essentially, hopefully, as a learning experience, you can give someone a resource and then build the rest of the learning experience around it and help guide those other steps. So the other thing is, especially when you're working with flows of content coming in, content curation can help create a culture of learning by working, creating a culture of continuous learning that's happening all the time. So it's not something that's separated from work. So small segments of learning that's happening constantly. So onto the main part of the presentation, the three types of content curation for learning. Essentially, I segmented it out into three things: repositories, streams of content, and learning experiences. Essentially, repositories are sort of static links to documents and websites that are often organized around tags. Sometimes there's sort of a mixture between streams of content and repositories as well. I'm also making a distinction here, by the way, that sometimes the things that sort of get called content curation that are more like automatic aggregators, things that sort of pick up other things off the internet and bring them into other platforms. Curation for me is a personal experience, something that someone does rather than someone that goes out and aggregates things. So one's sort of interesting as well that sometimes the streams of content, I actually just need to talk a little bit about streams of content. Streams of content are actually regular updates. They might be on a social network, might be daily or weekly. The thing is, they often include commentary about why a resource is important to an organization and employees. Very journalistic in its sort of approach. In actual fact, there's a podcast I did with one of the Sprouts, who's a graphic designer now, but previously she was a media journalist, and we talk about content curation and journalism because it sort of struck me with the streams of content. It was very similar to the process of being a journalist, of going out, finding things. And she sort of talked about the fact she would go out and find things that were newsworthy. And I talked about the idea of almost going out and finding things that were learner-worthy, and then putting your commentary and viewpoint around those to get those presented for your audience. So there's a lot to be learnt in actual this streams of content space from journalism is probably the best way to put it. The thing is that sometimes the streams of content can actually be in a spot where they can then go into a repository. So if you're using something like a blogging platform for building streams of content, then that goes into your archives, which then becomes searchable, which then becomes a really more like a repository. Then last but not least is learning experiences. I think this is actually the most exciting thing. So this is where essentially the other two approaches can be taken in. Learning experiences can be repositories. They're fairly static, or they can be streams. They can be campaigns that go over a period of time. So the thing is that the difference is that learning experiences don't just include commentary. They actually include learning tasks, things for people to do, and supports around those. And the tasks can even actually be social as well. So out of the three of these, generally, repositories have a low impact on behavior change. Streams of content will actually have some impact, and they will help foster a culture of learning by working by having constant streams of new information coming in. The highest impact will actually be on using learning experiences. The learning experience approach also means you can essentially build new course material by using existing resources and building the learning and supports around it, which then lowers your cost of your actual production for your courses as well. So just a bit of a side thing. Quite a few Sprout Labs clients have content libraries that they work with. And one of the best ways of getting more value from your content libraries is using a content curation approach, probably streams of content or the learning experience one, to really sort of surface to your people what's really happening in the content library. Now, I'm going to go through each one of the approaches and talk a little bit about features of them and give some examples as well. The actual interesting thing about the repository one is that essentially the seeking process is actually very similar for all of them. So in actual fact, I'm going to explore the seeking process a little bit more in this particular approach than what I do in the other ones. So seeking means you need sources, you need information flowing in. Then a content curator in this type of approach just tags them, and say in a platform like Glasshouse, we have a series of resources that you then have URLs, and you can write commentary around them, that you then tag them, and then you have a page which actually brings out and sits there and says, show everything with this particular page. And then that all becomes quite searchable as well. Now, one of the reasons why these sort of approaches quite often fail is because of lack of promotion. Because essentially they're static. They sort of quite often people build them and leave them. And it's one of those things that they need constant marketing, whereas the actual streaming approach has that sort of approach of marketing and pushing out constantly as a campaign style thing built into it, and that's quite powerful in itself. So, tools for actually building these sorts of repositories are things like Glasshouse, wikis, and things like the database activity in Tatara Learn, and blogs in Tatara Learn and Tatara Social as well. So, a little bit about seeking, and one of the most powerful tools for seeking is a thing called RSS feeds. I'm not going to say what they actually stand for. I get sick of abbreviations for things. But essentially what it is this idea that you have a content source. This comes out as an RSS feed, which is basically the content in a specific format without the visual design. Don't read it too much, it's quite complicated and techy looking. This then goes into an RSS feed reader. And this is actually how podcasts work, by the way, as well. They sort of have a content source and then feed back out to your readers, your players, sorry. So then an RSS feed reader is something like Feedly. So Feedly is one example of an RSS feed reader. It's actually become one of the most popular ones as well. So essentially it becomes a single site where you can come to one spot and then have all your feeds and coming from blogs and other sources all in one spot. It's really a powerful thing to be able to, rather than sort of search around everywhere, to be able to get to consume things quickly. I used to use Feedly a lot. Personally, I've actually resorted back to using my inbox and email newsletters just to possibly cope a little bit better with the flow. Feedly also has some really nice team features as well, including being able to sort of pin things and post things to a team board, and then building newsletters on a weekly basis based on what people actually put on a board as well. So it's quite sort of powerful for the notion of group curating, which we'll talk about in a few moments. So tagging. I talked before about the fact that as you're building that repository, you're organizing things around tags. You're putting something into a repository, putting a tag on it, and then displaying those tags. There's two different ways people work with tags. One, agreed set of tags, and then tagging as people evolve. I've personally seen this process of tags as people evolve, as things evolve, as being really chaotic. Actually, having an agreed set of tags is a whole lot more useful. Essentially, this act of tagging and organizing your resources is quite like what librarians do. So think about that sort of sense of organizing things the way a librarian might have. So it's a librarian sort of mindset. Personally, I find this notion of actually combining tags to get together using a semicolon really useful. So rather than having a year type of event and what it is, in this case, 19 webinar content curation, actually combining them all into a tag. Because then it means you can sort of do a search on webinar. You get all the tags coming through. It's got some nice sort of things about auto-completing for years and things as well. And that's quite sort of a powerful thing. It means it sometimes helps you reduce down basically the number of tags you have. Is probably my sentiment around that. So, streams of content is the next type of approach. Two styles of streams of content as well that I'm going to talk through. One, solo, a single person doing it. Two, a group of people working towards it. So essentially, a solo spot seeks very similar to repository. Sensing, it's about writing commentary, about thinking through what's being seen. And from an organizational point of view, from a learning point of view, it's probably about writing a commentary about sort of why is this important to the organization now? what might be your action steps around implementing this bit of knowledge in the organisation. And this is sort of interesting because a lot of these sort of solo things quite often in email newsletters. Now, people always complain about having an overwhelming amount of email. Yes, we do have a lot of email in our workplaces, but the reality is email is still the most effective marketing medium we have. Do you also think about the fact that you can actually use your social networks like the Tara Social for these things as well? So an example of one of these solo content curation experiences is Mike Taylor. Mike Taylor's newsletter is one of my highlights of the week. He's an ex-podcast person. He was part of the Learning Way We're Working conference last year. And I'd like to use it as an example because in actual fact, I actually asked Mike one day, how the hell do you get this done every week? You've got a full-time job. And he said, well, Robin, I sit down over breakfast and basically go through my Feedly. And actually, the newsletter is just really a summary of the best stuff I've come across in Feedly during the week. But there's also just some really nice things about the things that I think Mike does is he includes some personal notes as well. So particularly this one talks about his experience at the Learning Technologies Conference, some of the people he got to meet, some of the things that went wrong with losing his passport as well. He also shares these back out on Twitter. He's actually, in this particular one, talks about a really great presentation he's just done on content curation as well. One of my favourite bits of Mike's newsletters is this really simple roundup links at the end where he actually doesn't really put much commentary at all, but he's got them sort of nicely organised around sort of things like apps and books as well, and just this sort of personal viewpoint as well of what he's listening to. So essentially it's a spot where it's a solo person putting out a piece of commentary. Might be it's quite different in an organisation where it might need to have an organisational viewpoint more than a personal viewpoint like this particular one. So the next one is streams of content that are developed in a collaborative way. Now, there's two different styles of doing the collaboration in the content curation. One, where it might be a group of people, a fixed group of people. So it might be a group of L&D people or a group of subject matter experts who are sitting there saying, okay, we are the people who are doing content curation for the organisation. Or it might be that you actually essentially open up content curation as something in the whole of the organisation to do. So the idea is that essentially on your social network, you're in a spot where essentially everyone's encouraged to be in a spot where they're content curators like Stephen Downes, where they're in a spot where they're seeking, sensing, and sharing, in that sort of spot of being highly self-directed learners. Now, the reality about that is that on social networks, about 1% of people actively get involved. About 10% like or reshare and comment, and then about 90% just read. The risk with this particular approach is that you end up in a spot where essentially 1% of people will define your content. So it's actually in a spot where, as an organisation, from a strategy level, you can't really direct it. Is part of the issue. Now, another really nice one that I actually heard at one stage, was actually combining the repository and streams as well. It was in an organisation, there was a tech startup, they'd built a repository of links for new people to sit there and go, these are the basic tutorials you need to do before you can do A, B, and C. And as they get new interns in especially, they would sit there and discover that the interns would rediscover these links off the net, and then they'd sort of grow and sit there and go, they're actually in the repository. And there's something nice about the fact that those people were still probably that 1% of people who were discovering things and sharing things, but at the same time, that they were actually not accessing the bits and pieces that were already there because they were almost needing to discover it themselves. So a really good example of the group style sharing is one from Orion Health. Hamish from Orion Health did a great podcast on Tatara and XAPI, and this particular thing he talks about uses a thing called the XAPI PI booklet. So this sits up on your browser up towards the top. You go to a page, and then what you do is you essentially bookmark that page. Then comes up with essentially some information to be able to figure out and explain sort of what did you experience, give it a rating, put some notes around that. Now, what's really interesting about this is that's going into someone's personal learning log and learning store. But actually what happens at Orion Health is these go into essentially a repository that gets pulled out once a week, and all the links from a team members are sent to the rest of the teams. And it's quite a nice sort of way of being able to share, but not in a spot where it's sort of overwhelming flows of information all the time. So to this map, this approaches to collaborative, as I've just been talking about. So essentially open, everyone can comment on resources. It hopefully builds a beautiful culture of sharing and learning by working. A group-based situation, and to do the curation, e.g. a L&D team, or one of my favourite ones I've seen work many times is a rotational thing. So in actual fact, you might still have a solo person doing a content curation, but you actually rotate it around a subject matter expert per week, or per month, so that different people are getting that experience of being the self-guided person seeking, sensing, and sharing. And it's quite a powerful thing to be able to get people to do. So last but not least is learning experiences. So essentially, this particular spot, the sense is very different. So essentially, it's about taking and finding the right resources and building learning experiences that involve tasks and support to really sort of activate the content into actual behavioural change. Of course, this includes some sort of simple commentary as well. Now, the difference between this and the other streams is this really involves some sort of learning design expertise. You probably can't just throw a subject matter expert into being able to do this type of thing. Platforms for these are sort of interesting. Curator from H2 Labs is a platform that's perfectly designed for this sort of setup. Our own platform, Glasshouse, can do this type of thing as well, and Tatara Learn has a number of tools in it as well to be able to work with building these types of learning experiences. Basically, it's sort of that sense that a web-based authoring system can make this sort of process a whole lot easier. Now, the worst thing is, with these types of things, if you're not doing a campaign-style approach where you're actually taking a bit of content and sharing it back out over a period of time, you may actually find that you end up in a very similar experience to a repository where it's static. So you might need to be in a spot where you need to think about the marketing of that. Now, I talk through a couple of different experiences and examples of what I'm sort of talking about with this sort of learning experiences. The first one is TED Ed. And what this does is essentially, and it's interesting because both of these are quite educational experiences I'm talking through. There's this little nice notion of you watch and just reusing the material from the TED library. So then after you do the watch experience, you go into think. And there's some sort of digital learning, multiple choice experiences around that. And then you can dig deeper to get more resources and explore more. And then last but not least, some guided and open discussions as well. I think the sort of format of these sort of four things is really, really fantastic. I mean, essentially, it gives that sense of, and it might just need a whole watch, think, dig deeper, act as well. Could be another one that's more workplace focused as well. So it could be this sort of sense of, and the think could be actually sort of about practicing as well. But it sort of gives a template is what I'm probably getting at. That's quite a powerful spot. So this is another thing from medical education. So this particular medical educator runs Think Emergency. When I was talking to him about this, he was actually saying that he was revising these. So I'm going to be really interested to see what they are next time. Medical education is interesting because essentially a doctor is in a spot where they're having to deal with constant change of the practice. So they have to become very self-guided in their learning approaches. So some of the sort of learning styles that can be worked with them actually can help trigger self-guided learning quite nicely. Essentially, these are organized around passports of skills. So this is a passport skill that is about pediatrics, patients. Starts with prompting some questions, can you, self-assessment, then goes into the actual resources that are links back out onto the net, organized in different types of medium, which might be about also about how much time someone has got and also about what they can consume at that particular moment. Then it goes into a knowledge questions. These might be spots where people can use these to practice their retention of what they've just got from the resources, or they could be used as questions. It could be used between a registrar and supervisor as well. And then there's a workplace assessment template. So that in actual fact, there's a sense that yes, you are going through an experience where you're going out and looking at some resources, but you are meant to be activating this and actually implementing these things into the workplace. And the can then get measured in the outcome section. So to bring us back to this idea of content curation, helping our people become more self-guided learners. On this particular map is a grid of essentially the different sort of aspects of being a self-guided learner, the self-assessment, resources, being able to practice, articulate and measure. And then possible strategies put down towards the sort of resources, tasks, supports, and tasks in the 70 as well. So as you can see from this, there's sort of things at the beginning, things like self-assessments, having discussions with managers, setting personal goals. And then in actual fact, moving into the practice, there's actually things like simulated practice of things that might be more digital, like interactive stories or simulated tasks that might just be a series of multiple choice questions, right down to more powerful things that are more experiential, like job rotations or more mirroring. Mirroring is essentially a strategy quite often we use when we're designing programs where essentially two people do the same task, an experienced person and a trainee, and then essentially they compare and contrast their work that they do on that particular task as well. This is a fairly dense slide. I'm not going to read all of it. It'll be in the other material as well. And if you're watching this, you can see it anyway. So last but not least, the important thing to think about with content curation is tracking. So if you're going down the track of using web tools like SharePoint or blogs or Scoopit, you're actually in a spot where you lose a lot of your ability to track individuals. Because essentially web tools quite often end up evolving around Google Analytics for tracking. Google Analytics is absolutely awesome to be able to track trends, but not individuals. Literally, Google's usage guidelines don't allow you to use it for tracking individuals. If you want to be in a spot where you're bringing more more data in a richer way than into your learning systems and learning reporting systems, you're going to need to be looking at you doing your content creation systems in things that are learning systems like Curator, Glasshouse, Tatara Learn, especially if they are also XAPI enabled. It just gives you a different level of richness to those things as well. So if you're interested in taking a look at any of the platforms I've talked about or having a conversation about how Sprout Labs might be able to help you with your content creation, please just reply to any of the email messages that you've got from me or from Sprout Labs, and we can start a conversation. Thank you very much for watching this particular recording.